The rock face gave nothing. It did not offer handholds so much as it permitted them shallow cracks and jutting nubs of granite that a person had to earn with bleeding fingers and the kind of desperation that lives just below panic. Wren Calloway pressed her cheek against the stone and felt the cold of it move through her skin and into her teeth. Above her, the night sky over the Blue Ridge was a bruised and starless dark clouds, drawn across the mountains like a curtain pulled by an indifferent hand. Below her, the world she was leaving had already shrunk to nothing. She did not look down. She had learned very young that looking backward was a luxury, and she had never been given many of those. Her left hand found a narrow ledge barely wide enough for 2 fingers. She tested it, weighted it, and pulled herself up another 8 inches. Her boots scraped against the rock face, searching for purchase on a surface that did not want to be climbed. The canvas straps of the rucksack cut into her shoulders with a pressure that had moved past pain and into something more permanent, something she suspected she would feel in her bones for years if she survived the night. Inside the pack, pressed against her spine, Pat shifted. A small adjustment of weight, a faint exhale that she felt more than heard. He was still breathing. That was all she needed to know. The wind came off the peaks in long, searching gusts that pressed into the spaces between her body and the rock, trying to find something to peel loose. She tightened every muscle she had and waited for it to pass. Her forearms burned. The cut across her right palm where the rock had taken a thin strip of skin on her third handhold had stopped bleeding and started to crust, and now every time she gripped a new edge, it split open again with a quiet, intimate pain that was almost like a reminder. "You are here," it said. "You are doing this. Keep going." She had been climbing for over an hour. She did not think about what waited at the top. She had learned that thinking too far ahead was how you fell. She thought only about the next hold, the next 3 inches, the next moment of her own weight shifting upward. This was the only arithmetic that mattered on a cliff face in the dark. Everything else, the boy at the gate, the office that smelled of leather and calculation, the thin, bloodless smile of a man she had spent 10 years trying never to think about directly. All of it receded into the background noise of her own breathing and the quiet labor of survival. She had been doing that her whole life, reducing the unbearable to the manageable, breaking the impossible into the next small thing. One more hold, one more foot of elevation, one more breath. It had not always been the mountain. Before the mountain, there had been the Holt Foundling Home. She had arrived there at 8 years old, though she could not have told you precisely how it happened, the way children cannot fully narrate the circumstances of their own displacement. What she remembered was the smell first. The Holt Foundling Home smelled of lye soap and boiled starch, in the stale recycled air of a building where windows were rarely open, because the man who owned the building believed that fresh air was a variable and variables were inefficiencies. It was a large building on the edge of Ashford, North Carolina, built of pale stone that looked cold even in summer, with long dormitory halls and high windows that let in light but not warmth. The grounds were swept clean every morning by the older children. The flower beds were maintained in geometrically precise rows. Everything at the Holt Foundling Home was maintained in geometrically precise rows, including the children. Aldous Holt was not a violent man. This was important to understand about him because it was the thing that made him so difficult to fight. A violent man left marks you could show people. A violent man gave you a language for what he was doing to you. Aldous Holt never raised his voice above a pleasant conversational register. He never struck a child. He never even touched one, really, except for the occasional formal handshake offered to the older boys before they were sent to the mill or the quarry, or the vast stretches of timberland he was methodically acquiring in the valleys west of town. His suits were always immaculate. His silver-tipped cane tapped a gentle rhythmic beat on the polished floors when he made his evening rounds through the dormitories, not to comfort, but to observe. His eyes moved over the rows of cots with the same expression he used when reviewing the inventory ledgers in his office. Calm, precise, assessing the condition of assets. He believed in order. He believed in productivity. He believed that sentiment was waste and that waste was sin. not the religious kind. He had little patience for the religious kind, but the practical kind. The kind that showed up as red ink in the margins of a ledger and demanded explanation. What Aldous Holt understood with a clarity that approached genius was that you did not need to hurt people to control them. You only needed to ensure that they had nothing of their own. No loyalties, no attachments, no private warmths that existed outside the structure he had built. He achieved this slowly, systematically, the way you drain a field one channel at a time until what had been wet and living was dry and workable. He separated children who showed signs of becoming friends. He moved the older ones before bonds could solidify. He gave no child a name for what they were losing, because a loss you cannot name is a loss you cannot grieve, and a child who cannot grieve cannot organize their grief into anything as dangerous as resistance. Wren had understood this by the time she was 11, not in those words, but the way you understand a cold draft in a room. You cannot see it, but you know the direction it comes from, and you learn to sit somewhere else. She had made herself useful. That was her survival strategy, and it was a good one. She worked faster than anyone else. She asked for less than anyone else. She kept her face neutral and her opinions to herself, and she built around the small, flickering coal of her own interior life a wall of silent competence that Holt found acceptable and therefore left alone. She was not special to him. Special was dangerous. She was simply reliable, a tool that did not require maintenance. And in his system, that was the safest thing to be. The crack in that wall was Patch. She had found him behind the kitchen building on a gray October afternoon when she was 16, half buried in a pile of potato skins and ash, a puppy of no discernible parentage, all over large paws and protruding ribs, and a coat the color of muddy creek water, with a single white patch over his left eye that looked like something a child had painted on as an afterthought. He was not moving when she found him. She thought he was dead. Then she touched him, and he made a sound, not quite a whimper, not quite a breath. Something in between, and she had looked around the empty kitchen yard and made a decision so fast it barely registered as a decision at all. She kept him in the crawl space beneath the laundry building for 3 weeks, smuggling scraps inside her clothing, teaching him silence with a patience she did not know she possessed. When he outgrew the crawl space, she moved him to the root cellar and then to a hidden corner of the old equipment shed at the edge of the grounds. She named him Patch for the white mark over his eye. She told no one. She had learned very thoroughly by then that the things you loved were the things that could be taken. And so the most important thing was to love secretly, carefully, the way you carry a candle in the wind, cupped in both hands. Body turned against the weather. For 2 years it worked. Then came the morning of the trousers. His name was Fen, and he was 6 years old, and he had been at the Holt Foundling Home for 4 months. He was a small, quiet boy with a watchful quality that Wren recognized as a child in the early stages of learning to disappear. He had arrived in autumn wearing a pair of trousers that were already slightly too short, and by February they had become considerably worse. And the week before the incident, he had tripped in the courtyard and torn the left knee open on the gravel in a way that left a ragged gap the size of a man's hand. The policy at the home was that children received new clothing at the beginning of each season. February was not the beginning of a season. A torn garment was the child's responsibility. A child who appeared at morning inspection with a torn garment received a demerit, and demerits had consequences that Wren did not like to think about. She had waited until the dormitory was dark and still, until the only sounds were the varied breathing of sleeping children and the distant tap of Holt's cane fading down the east corridor. And then she had taken the trousers from where Fen had folded them under his cot mattress, a habit all the children developed, keeping their possessions as close to their bodies as possible, and she had carried them to the small window at the end of the hall where a little moonlight came through, and she had mended them. She had a needle and a length of gray thread she had been saving for almost a year, kept wound around a scrap of cardboard and tucked inside the lining of her left boot. It took her most of the night. She was not a skilled seamstress, but she was careful, and by the time the sky began to pale, she had closed the tear well enough that it would pass inspection. She folded the trousers and slipped them back under Fen's mattress and went to her own cot and lay there with her eyes open, listening to the morning begin. She did not think Holt had seen her. She was wrong about that. He summoned her to his office after the morning meal, and she went the way she always went to his office, with her hands loose at her sides and her face arranged into the careful blankness she had spent years perfecting. The office smelled of leather and wood smoke, and the old paper scent of ledgers and contracts and the machinery of ownership. He was standing at the window when she entered, looking out at the grounds, with his hands clasped behind his back, and he did not turn around immediately, which was one of his techniques. The pause was a tool. She understood this and kept her breathing even. When he finally turned, he was smiling. It was a thin expression, technically a smile the way a diagram of a smile is technically a smile. It occupied his face without reaching any of the places where a real smile might have lived. He did not mention the trousers. He said in the pleasant, measured voice he used for everything, "It has come to my attention that you have been harboring an animal on the property. This represents a misallocation of resources. It creates hygiene concerns, and it represents most fundamentally a failure to understand the proper ordering of loyalty." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "The dog will be removed by noon today. Consider this a lesson in priorities, not a punishment. I bear you no ill will. I simply require that you understand the difference between sentiment and sense." He waited. Wren said nothing. She had nothing to say that would make any difference, and she understood that. And so she kept her face neutral and her hands loose, and she nodded once the way she had learned to nod, in a way that gave him nothing. He dismissed her with a slight movement of his hand, the way you might close a ledger you had finished with. She walked back down the corridor at the same pace she always walked. She did not run. She did not make any sound. She went to the equipment shed, and she sat down on the cold floor next to Patch, and Patch put his head in her lap and looked up at her with the white patched eye and the brown one, and she sat there for a long time with her hand on his warm side, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. She was not thinking about the dog, not exactly. She was thinking about something Holt had said, the proper ordering of loyalty. She had been hearing variations of that phrase her entire life at the home, in the speeches at morning assembly, in the quiet corrections delivered in corridor conversations, in the entire architecture of a place designed to ensure that every child's primary loyalty was to the institution, to its rules, to the man who ran it. And she had complied with that, or appeared to, for 10 years. She had been the model of compliance. But she was 18 now. She was not 8. She had been building a wall around herself for a decade, and she had done it so well that she had almost forgotten what the wall was built to protect. Sitting on the cold floor with Patch's head in her lap, she remembered. She was not going to let him take the dog. And she was not going to stay in this place until Holt decided it was time for her to become useful to one of his other enterprises. She had seen the older girls go to the laundry in town. She had seen the older boys disappear into the quarry and come back in the evenings with hands so abraded they could barely hold a fork. She was not going to be sent somewhere. She was going to leave. She spent the day in a controlled, deliberate calm that she recognized as the most useful emotion she had ever developed. She thought through what she needed, and she thought through what she had, and by the time the sun was low and the home was settling into its evening routines, she had a plan that was not good, but was possible, and possible was enough. Stale bread from the kitchen wrapped in cloth, a small tin of water, her blanket thin as it was rolled tight, the rucksack she had spent 3 months reinforcing with extra stitching along the seams and shoulder straps, doing it a little at a time when no one was watching, because she had been planning this without fully admitting to herself that she was planning it. The needle and thread from her boot, the last of the quinine powder she had found in the medicine cabinet during her rotation through the infirmary the previous winter, and a small jar of the salve the cook kept for kitchen burns that she took without particular guilt. She ate her supper without tasting it. She attended evening assembly. She went to her cot. She lay in the dark and listened to the dormitory settle into sleep around her, and she thought about the mountain. Everyone in Ashford knew about the Forbidden Ravine. It was spoken of in the tone reserved for things that were meant to discourage inquiry, a tone that combined disgust and finality in equal measure, a tone that said this conversation is over before it has begun. The ravine was on the far side of a sheer granite ridge above the town, accessible only by a climb that most people would not attempt in daylight, let alone in darkness. 30 years ago, Aldous Holt had declared the entire area off-limits to the public, citing contaminated water and dangerous terrain, and a handful of other reasons that people had accepted without much examination, because Holt was the kind of man whose reasons people accepted. The ravine was poison, everyone said. Beasts and bad air. No sane person would go there. To Ren Calloway at 18, sitting in the dark of the dormitory, with 10 years of careful invisibility pressing down on her chest, it sounded like the only place in the world where Aldous Holt had no leverage. She waited until the cane had stopped tapping. She waited another hour beyond that. Then she rose dressed in her warmest things and loaded the rucksack with everything she had prepared. She lifted Patch from his place at the foot of her cot and settled him into the reinforced body of the pack with a patience and quietness she had been practicing in her mind all day, speaking to him in a breath that was barely even a whisper, a sound she made more with her lips than her lungs. He turned twice and settled. He seemed to understand that this was a different kind of quiet than their usual quiet. He had always been good at understanding her. She moved through the dormitory the way she had learned to move through all the spaces of the home, with the deliberate lightness of someone who has spent years learning to take up as little space as possible. Down the back stairwell, through the kitchen corridor which smelled of that evening's boiled supper and the accumulated ghost of 10 years of boiled suppers before it, past the scullery, to the back door that led to the kitchen yard, which she had noticed 3 days ago was no longer latching properly on the inside, a small failure in Holt's machinery that she had noted without expression and filed away. The night air hit her face like cold water. She stood still for a moment and let her eyes adjust to the dark. The kitchen yard was empty. Beyond the yard was the equipment shed, and beyond that the low stone wall at the edge of the property, and beyond that the road, and beyond the road the long slope of dark pines that climbed toward the ridge. She crossed the yard. She went past the equipment shed without looking at it, because she had said what needed to be said to Patch already in the dark of the dormitory, and there was nothing in the shed anymore that was part of her life. She reached the gate at the back of the property, the narrow one behind the equipment shed that was used for deliveries, and she stopped. Fenn was standing there. He was wearing his coat, the thin one that was too small for him, and he had a small bundle held against his chest with both arms, the way a child holds something they are afraid of losing. He had packed his things. It was not much. A change of socks, a small carved wooden horse that Wren had seen him keep under his pillow. He was looking at her with the absolute focused attention of a 6-year-old who has made up his mind and is waiting to see if the world will cooperate. Wren looked at him and felt something shift painfully inside her chest. She looked at the bundle he was holding. She looked at the rucksack on her back, at the weight of Patch in it, at the way the straps were already cutting into her shoulders. She looked at the ridge above the town, invisible in the dark, but present in her knowledge of it, 1,000 feet of sheer granite that she was going to climb in the dark with bleeding hands and nothing but determination and the recklessness of someone who has run out of better options. She could not do it carrying a 6-year-old. She could not do it carrying both of them. The math was simple and terrible. She crouched down in front of him. The moonlight was thin and intermittent, sliding between clouds, and in it his face was very young and very certain in the way that children are certain before the world teaches them doubt. She reached into the front pocket of her coat. She had the half loaf of bread she had wrapped for herself. She gave it to him. She had a small square of paper she had torn from the back of a hymnal months ago and written on in the careful small handwriting she had taught herself using the home's account ledgers when no one was watching. An address: the Presbyterian Church on Caldwell Street in Ashford, 3/4 of a mile from the home. A minister there who had twice quietly defied Holt's preference for children to stay in the home rather than be fostered out. She pressed the paper into Fenn's hand. Then she reached up to her left wrist, where she wore a thin cord of red cotton. She had braided herself 2 years ago from threads she had unraveled from a worn-out work apron. She wore it knotted there because it was the only piece of adornment she had ever permitted herself, and it had no significance to anyone but her. and she untied it now with hands that were steadier than she thought they should be, and she tied it around Fenn's wrist above the sleeve of his thin coat, in a double knot that would hold. She looked at him directly the way she had rarely looked at any person in this place fully, and without the careful blankness she kept over her face like a lid. "Wait at the church," she said. Her voice was almost no sound at all. "I'll come back." Fenn looked at her wrist where the cord had been. He looked at his own wrist where it was now. He nodded once with the solemnity of a child accepting a serious responsibility. She stood up. She made herself turn away from him and walk toward the road. She kept her pace even. She did not run until she reached the pines, and even then she did not run toward anything so much as she moved forward with a controlled urgency that would not allow her to look back. She did not look back. The slope through the pines was steep enough to make her thighs burn within the first 10 minutes. The forest was dark in the way of mountain forests at night, not uniformly dark, but variously dark. Pockets of deeper shadow beneath the older trees, in the occasional pale interruption, where moonlight found a gap in the canopy and laid itself across the pine needles in a strip of cold silver. She moved upward, finding the angle of least resistance where she could, pushing through the tangles of rhododendron that covered the middle elevations of the ridge in dense, near impenetrable masses of twisted branches. Patch was good. He had shifted his weight once toward the beginning of the slope and then settled himself against her back with a stillness that suggested he was either asleep or conserving energy with the same instinct she was. The tree line ended abruptly the way it always does on the eastern face of a Blue Ridge, giving way suddenly to bare granite that rose in a long angled face toward the dark sky. Wren stopped at the edge of the trees and looked up at it. She could not see the top. She could see perhaps 150 feet of rock face above her before the dark took it, and she knew from looking at it in daylight from the roads below that the total climb was somewhere close to 400 feet. Though she could not be certain, and it did not particularly matter. She flexed her hands. She had taken her gloves off because gloves on a rock face are worse than nothing. They give you the illusion of grip without the reality of it. Her palms were cold. She pressed them flat against the granite for a moment and felt the stone's indifference, its complete and magnificent lack of interest in whether she succeeded or failed. She began to climb. The first 100 feet were manageable. The rock had more texture in the lower section, old cracks and weathered holes that had been there for 10,000 years of freeze and thaw, and her hands found them with something close to confidence. Patch's weight shifted her center of gravity backward, and she had to compensate continuously, pressing her hips into the rock face, keeping more of her weight forward than felt natural. Her arms were strong from 2 years of laundry work and carrying supply crates from the delivery wagons, but strong arms on a climbing wall are only part of the equation. The other part is nerve. The other part is the ability to look at a hold that your mind says is impossible and reach for it anyway. Somewhere in the second 100 feet, the rock changed character. It became smoother, more vertical, the hold shallower and further apart. The wind that had been a background presence became something more intentional, pressing against her back and trying to peel her fingers from the stone. Her right hand was bleeding again. She could feel the warmth of it between her fingers in the cold of the rock, a sensation that would have been unpleasant in any other context, but now was merely information. She noted it and kept moving. She did not think about what she was leaving. She did not think about the home or the dormitory or the sound of Holt's cane on polished floors or the thin smile in the leather-smelling office. She did not think about Fenn and the red cord or the church on Caldwell Street or whether a 6-year-old could find his way 3/4 of a mile through Ashford in the dark. She thought about the next hold. She thought about the placement of her feet. She thought about keeping her weight forward and her breathing steady and moving upward, always upward, because the only thing that made any of the rest of it bearable was elevation. At some point, the clouds broke open and the moon came through fully, and in that pale flood of silver light, she could see the top of the ridge closer than she had expected. 50 feet, maybe less. She pressed herself against the rock and breathed and felt Patch's warmth against her spine, and she did not allow herself to feel anything that resembled hope, because hope on a cliff face was a distraction she could not afford. She climbed. Her fingers found the lip of the precipice. She felt at the sudden edge where the vertical became horizontal, and she grabbed it with both hands, and she kicked and scrambled and clawed herself over the top with an inelegance that would have been embarrassing if anyone had been there to see it. She rolled onto a surface of pine needles and cold moss, and she lay there on her back with the rucksack lifting her shoulders off the ground and the stars wheeling overhead, and her chest heaving as she dragged the thin, high-altitude air into her lungs in great shuddering pulls. She lay like that for what felt like a long time. Then she shrugged the rucksack carefully from her shoulders and set it beside her, and opened the top, and Patch came out in a scramble of paws and warm, solid weight, and he immediately began licking her face, and then finding her hands licking the blood from her fingers with a thorough, gentle attention that she could not entirely keep herself together through. She pressed her face into the warm fur between his ears and stayed there for a long moment, breathing him in. Then she sat up and looked at what was in front of her. The ravine opened below the ridge like something the mountain had decided to say. It was vast in the way that wild things are vast when you see them without the mediation of roads or fences or any of the structures humans build to make the earth feel manageable. It dropped away in steep forested walls, the ancient pines clinging to the slopes with the deep-rooted tenacity of things that have been growing in difficult places since before anyone was there to notice them. The floor of the ravine was invisible beneath a river of mist that coiled and shifted in the pre-dawn air, obscuring whatever lay below in a slow white churning that looked both beautiful and absolute. The trees were bearded with long drapes of moss that moved in the updraft with a slow rhythmic pulse like breathing. The air was different up here. Wren noticed that before anything else. It was thick and alive in a way that the air at the home had never been dense with the smell of wet stone and pine resin and the rich earthiness of old, undisturbed ground. It was silent in a way that was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a place that had been doing something of its own for a very long time and was simply continuing to do it, indifferent to witnesses. Aldous Holt had told the town this place was poison. He had told them for 30 years, and they had believed him because he was the kind of man whose certainty made other people doubt their own. Wren Calloway sat on the lip of the forbidden ravine with her bleeding hands in her lap and her dog pressing his warm weight against her side, and she looked out over the dark, misted depths of the thing she had been told would kill her. And she felt for the first time in 10 years something that was not the careful management of surviving. She felt something simpler and more animal than that. Something that was not quite peace and not quite freedom, but was adjacent to both, the way the pre-dawn darkness is adjacent to light. She was not going to let it comfort her too much. She knew better than that. She had crossed a cliff face in the dark and arrived somewhere she had never been, with a little food and a thin blanket and a dog and raw hands. And the man who had spent 10 years cataloging her as inventory would notice her absence in the morning, and he would not simply accept it. She was a loose thread. He did not tolerate loose threads. But that was tomorrow's problem. And tomorrow, she had decided long ago, would always be a problem she was capable of solving. She settled Patch back into the pack with apologies and the last crust of bread from her own portion, and she descended into the ravine. The first days were their own kind of education. The mist on the floor of the ravine was cold enough that she moved through it with her arms folded against her chest, feeling the dampness press into her clothing and settle against her skin. The light came down through the canopy in long filtered columns that turned the mist into something almost luminous in the mornings, and then faded through the afternoons into a general green-tinged dimness. The silence was not silence exactly once you learned to listen into it. There were hawks. There were the distant, variable sounds of water trickling and rushing at different pitches from different directions, suggesting sources she had not yet located. There were the small, industrious sounds of the forest doing what forests do, the crack of settling wood, the rustle of something in the undergrowth, the soft percussion of pine cones releasing from high branches. She and Patch moved through it together with the careful mutual attentiveness of two creatures who have decided to trust each other completely and are now working out the practical implications of that arrangement. Patch's nose sifted the air, constantly swinging in small arcs, and she watched him the way she had learned to watch everything in this place for information. His ears rose at certain sounds and relaxed at others, and she began to catalog the difference. What made him alert versus what made him merely curious versus what made him put himself slightly in front of her and stand very still. On the second day, she found the cave a shallow scoop in the granite of the western slope, hidden behind a curtain of cascading ivy that draped down the rock face in a solid green mass. She nearly walked past it. Patch stopped and looked at it, and she looked where he was looking, and she pushed through the ivy and found the opening. It was not large, perhaps 10 feet deep and 8 feet wide, with a ceiling that sloped down toward the back. But the floor was dry, and the stone around it had the faint warmth of rock that faces south and captures sun through the day. She spent the rest of the afternoon and most of the following morning making it habitable, clearing the loose rock and debris, gathering fallen pine branches, and stripping them of needles to build a floor layer that would insulate them from the cold stone, packing the gaps in the ivy curtain with moss to cut the wind. Her hands ached with the work. She did not stop. She gathered what she could identify. Berries from 2 different shrubs, testing each with the careful graduated method she had read about once in a nature almanac that had made its way into the home's small library, a touch to the lip, a wait, a small bite, a longer wait. One variety was sour but harmless. The other she left alone. She found a seep in the rock face 200 yards from the cave, where water trickled in a thin, constant thread from a crack in the stone cold and clear, tasting of minerals and depth. She drank from it, cupped in her hands, and let Patch drink beside her. She had not seen another person. She had heard nothing that suggested pursuit. She did not allow herself to find this reassuring. On the 4th morning, she woke to gray early light and the sound of Patch at the mouth of the cave, standing at the gap in the ivy curtain, with his nose working and his tail doing something uncertain. Not the low sweep warning wag, but not the loose happy wave either. Something in between. She was on her feet before she had fully processed the sensory information, the old reflexes of the home still sharp in her, the training of 10 years of needing to be ready before she was fully conscious. She moved to the ivy curtain and looked through a gap. The flat stone 4 feet in front of the cave entrance, a broad plate of granite that she had been using as a work surface, had something on it that had not been there when she fell asleep. A small, carefully wrapped parcel, brown paper tied with a length of natural fiber twine. Wren did not move for a long time. Her first thought was a trap. Holt's men. That was her first thought, and she held it for a full breath before her mind caught up with her fear. But Holt did not lay traps. Holt did not need to. He sent men with legal papers and physical leverage, and the confidence of someone who had never needed to be subtle about his authority. They did not crouch in the forest outside a hidden cave and leave carefully wrapped provisions for someone they had been sent to retrieve. This was something else entirely. She stood still for what felt like an eternity and watched the forest around the cave entrance with every piece of attention she had. The trees did not move except in the wind. No shadows resolved into shapes. No sound separated itself from the forest's ambient voice into something human. The ravine simply continued being the ravine, massive and patient and unconcerned. Patch had subsided from whatever the uncertain tail wag had meant to a simple sitting alertness, his nose still working. She reached through the ivy and used the long stick she had kept since the 2nd day, and she nudged the parcel. Nothing. She pulled it closer. Still nothing. Then she brought it inside the cave and set it on the flat stone she used as a table and sat down in front of it with Patch pressed against her thigh. The smell came through the paper before she had finished untying the twine. Rich and dense and unmistakable, the smell of smoke-cured meat. Her stomach responded to it before her mind had finished processing the implications, a sharp, almost painful contraction that reminded her how many days it had been since she had eaten anything with real caloric density. She opened the parcel, 3 thick strips of dried venison, and wrapped separately in a fold of the same brown paper, a bundle of broad-leafed herbs that she recognized from the home's small medicinal supply, the ones kept for fever, broad-leafed and pungent, the kind of thing that required specific knowledge to gather and identify correctly. Someone had not grabbed these at random. Someone had looked at this parcel and thought about both immediate hunger and possible illness, and provided for both. She sat back on her heels and looked at the parcel and thought about that. She shared a strip of the venison with Patch that evening, tearing it in half with a clean motion and giving him the larger piece because he was bigger and because she could afford to. The flavor of it, salty and dense and smoky, was so far beyond anything she had eaten in days that it was almost difficult to process. She ate slowly in small pieces, the way you eat when you are not sure when you will eat again. Someone knew she was here. She spent the rest of the day with that fact, turning it over, examining it from different angles, the way you examine something unfamiliar and potentially dangerous before deciding what to do with it. The prickling sensation at the back of her neck that she had been half aware of since the second day in the ravine resolved itself now into something she could name. She had been watched. She was being watched. From somewhere in the dense vertical world of the ravine's forested walls, someone had been observing her, tracking her movements, learning the location of her cave, and then choosing deliberately and anonymously to help. Not Holt, not pursuit, something she did not have a word for yet. She sat at the mouth of the cave as the light died out of the western sky, and the ravine filled up slowly with the blue-gray dusk that preceded full dark. And she looked out at the ancient pines and the curtains of hanging moss, and the mist beginning to form again along the floor of the chasm far below. And she thought about what kind of person would watch a runaway girl and her dog for 4 days and then leave food instead of coming to the door. She thought about the herbs. Someone had considered the possibility of fever. Someone had thought that through. High above her on a ledge on the ravine's northern wall that was not visible from any of the places she had been, a figure sat in the last of the failing light with a brass spyglass resting across his knees. He was old, with hands that were more knuckle than flesh, and a face that had been weathered past any specific age into something that seemed to have always been old. He sat with the stillness of someone who had spent 30 years learning to be part of the landscape, to reduce himself to the ambient data of the forest until he was as unremarkable as a broken branch or a pattern in the stone. He watched the small wisp of smoke she had learned to make barely visible, finding the driest wood, keeping the fire to the size it needed to be and no larger. He had seen the girl 4 days ago, a flicker of movement in a place where no movement should be. He had watched through the spyglass as she found the cave, as she gathered wood with abraded hands, as she tested berries with the careful method of someone who had read about this somewhere but never actually done it. He had watched her and Patch move through the ravine with the careful mutual attentiveness of two creatures who had made a pact. He knew where she had come from. Everyone who had lived in the shadow of the Blue Ridge for more than a season knew about Aldous Holt and his cold charity, and the children who came and went from that pale stone building on the edge of Ashford. And Silas Greer knew more about Aldous Holt than most, though it was knowledge that had cost him more than he had ever been willing to fully calculate, paid in the currency of 30 years of chosen solitude, in the daily, grinding work of living with what he had not done when doing it would have mattered. He set the spyglass on the ledge beside him and looked at his own hands in the last of the light. He had left the parcel that morning before sunrise. He had set it on the flat stone with as much care as he had given anything in a long time. The placement had been deliberate, close enough to find far enough from the cave entrance to suggest that whoever left it was not interested in knowing exactly where she slept. It was a coward's offering. He knew that. It was the smallest possible thing he could have done, a package of dried meat and herbs left in the dark, requiring nothing of him that resembled courage or confrontation or any of the things he had been failing at for 3 decades. But it was a start. Somewhere below, the smoke from Wren's small, careful fire was barely distinguishable from the mist rising off the ravine floor. Silas Greer watched it until the dark took it entirely, and then he sat in the full dark of the mountain night and felt the old stone of guilt in his chest shift fractionally for the first time in 30 years. Corwin Marsh did not consider himself a man who made moral decisions. He made practical ones. There was a difference, and he had spent the better part of 4 years convincing himself that the difference mattered, that a man who did what was necessary to survive was not the same as a man who did what was wrong, that the space between those two things was large enough to live in without too much discomfort. He had been moderately successful at this until the morning he pushed through a thicket of mountain laurel on the upper tributary of the ravine's main creek and found himself standing 6 feet from a girl with a piece of flint in her hand and a dog in front of her that was not barking. The dog not barking was what stopped him. A barking dog was manageable. A dog that had made a calculation and decided that silence was more strategic than noise was something else entirely, something that required a different kind of attention. The animal stood between him and the girl with its shoulder blades raised and its weight distributed forward and its eyes on Corwin with an intelligence that he found unsettling in the specific way that competence in unexpected places is always unsettling. He raised his hands. It was an instinctive gesture, the universal human signal for "I am not doing what you think I am doing," and he held them there at shoulder height and stood completely still and took stock of what he had walked into. The girl was pressed against the rock face of the slope behind her. She was younger than he had expected to find in the ravine which he had been told, and had no reason to disbelieve was uninhabited and uninhabitable. She was wearing clothes that had not been warm enough for the past several days of cold, and were now also dirty with the specific grime of outdoor survival, the kind that settles into fabric and skin alike. Her hair was dark and cut short, not fashionably, but practically, the way you cut hair when you have no mirror and no patience. Her face was smudged with the dust of the ravine and something that might have been charcoal from a fire, and her eyes were the color of creek water over granite, and were currently giving him exactly the kind of assessment he would have expected from a cornered animal that had not yet decided whether to run or fight. Her hands, he noticed. Her hands were what caught him. She was holding the flint with a white-knuckled grip, but that was not what he was looking at. He was looking at the state of them. The abraded knuckles, the dark lines of dried blood across the palms, the raw redness of skin that had been put through more than skin was designed for in a short period of time. He had seen hands like that before. His daughter had small hands, and they had never looked like that, and they never would now. And he did not pursue that thought further because there was no useful place it led. He took a slow breath. He kept his hands up and his body still, and he tried to arrange his face into something that communicated that he was aware of how this looked and wished to correct the impression. "I am surveying the creek," he said. He kept his voice at the volume of conversation, no louder, no softer. "For Mr. Holt." He said the name and watched what it did to her face. It did not make her more afraid. That was interesting. It made her harder, a subtle shift in the set of her jaw and the focus of her eyes that moved the expression from cornered to something closer to confirmed, as though the name had answered a question she had been carrying. She did not speak. She held the flint, and she looked at him with the flat, measuring attention of someone who has been evaluating threats since childhood and has become very good at it. He was aware that he had obligations in this moment. His employment with Aldous Holt was explicit about the reporting of trespassers, and the description of this girl matched well enough with the information that had circulated quietly through Holt's operation 3 days ago. A runaway from the home, 18 years old, dark hair, traveling with a dog. There would be a finder's consideration. It would not be a large sum, but it would be something. And Corwin Marsh was a man who had learned to pay close attention to sums of any size, because large sums had a way of not existing when you needed them, and small ones had to fill the space where they should have been. He looked at the dog, which had not moved and was still watching him with that unnerving, focused patience. He looked at the girl's hands. He thought about his daughter, who had been 4 years old when the fever took her, and about how she had looked at him in the last days with absolute trust that he was going to fix it, that fathers fix things, that this was the foundational agreement of the world she had been born into, and she had not yet lived long enough to understand that it was not always true. He had not fixed it. He had sat beside her cot in the boarding house room, and he had held her small hand, and he had been entirely unable to fix it. and the fever had come from bad water, and the bad water had come from the upstream contamination that three separate residents of Lower Ashford had reported to the town council, and the town council had reported to Aldous Holt. And Aldous Holt had documented and filed and done nothing about, because the cost of doing something about it exceeded the cost of doing nothing. When you calculated it the way Holt calculated things, Corwin Marsh had taken the surveying job 8 months later because he needed the money and because the work took him into the mountains, where he did not have to look at the town and the town did not have to look at him. He had told himself many things about that decision. He had become practiced at the telling. "He doesn't need to know I was here," Corwin said. His voice came out steadier than he had expected. "And I was never here." He held her gaze for one more moment, long enough to make sure she had heard him and understood him and was not going to startle into something irreversible. Then he took a slow step backward, and another. He kept his hands where she could see them until the mountain laurel closed between them and the girl and the dog were behind the green curtain of the ravine. And then he was alone on the slope with the sound of the creek to his left and the weight of what he had just decided pressing down on him in a way that was not entirely unpleasant. He stood there for a while in the middle of the slope, looking at nothing in particular. Then he unslung his field satchel and went through it with the methodical attention of a man taking inventory. He had a small tin of salve he kept for the blisters that surveying work raised on his hands in the early weeks of a new season. He had a paper envelope of powdered quinine that he carried as a matter of professional habit because mountain water sources were not always what they appeared to be, and he had learned to take certain precautions. He set them together on a relatively dry piece of flat ground at the edge of the clearing, in a place visible from the slope above, but not obviously placed, not arranged in a way that announced itself too loudly. Then he shouldered the satchel and continued up the slope to finish his measurements, because if he came back to camp without measurements, Holt's foreman would ask questions, and questions were what he was trying to avoid. He did not look back at the clearing. He did the measurements with the careful automatic precision of someone whose hands know their work well enough to do it without requiring the full participation of the mind, and his mind spent the time it was released from on a problem that had no clean solution. He had falsified these measurements, not all of them, not in ways that were immediately obvious, but in ways that would matter, in ways that were specifically and deliberately designed to matter. The bends in the upper tributary that his charts showed as minor seasonal flows were in reality something considerably more significant. He knew this because he had taken the actual measurements himself before the falsification and had looked at the numbers and understood exactly what they described: a permanent high-volume water source in the ravine's upper watershed, clean and cold, and sufficient for a town twice the size of Ashford. He had a copy of those real measurements. He kept them in a locked tin box in his rented room in town, inside a false bottom he had constructed himself from a piece of board and a length of wire. He also had a letter written in Holt's own hand, directing him to adjust the figures. He had kept the letter for the same reason he had kept the measurements, the same reason a man in a dangerous place keeps any information that might be the only thing standing between him and the full weight of someone else's consequences. Insurance, the kind you hope to never use. He had been telling himself for 8 months that he was keeping those documents because he was practical, not because he intended to do anything with them. He had been doing a reasonable job of believing this. He was slightly less certain of it now. The sky came in wrong over the next 2 days. Corwin noticed it from the work camp on the upper slope, the quality of pressure in the air changing the temperature, dropping at midday instead of rising, the strange stillness of the high elevation wind that had been constant since he arrived, and now was not. He had grown up in these mountains, had spent enough seasons in the Blue Ridge backcountry to have developed the kind of weather sense that is less a skill than a slow accumulation of survived experience. And what his accumulated experience told him in the face of that windless, heavy, bruised purple sky was that something was coming that would make conditions in the ravine significantly worse than they already were. He thought about the girl. He noted that he was thinking about her, flagged it as information, and returned to his measurements. The storm broke just past midnight on the 9th day. He heard it begin from the canvas of his camp shelter on the upper ridge. a sound like a river starting somewhere above, and then the sudden absolute percussion of rain hitting stone and earth and canopy with a force that suggested the sky had been holding it back for some time and had simply run out of the structural integrity to continue. The camp shelter held. He lay on his bedroll and listened to the mountain rearrange itself outside and thought with a specificity that surprised him about a shallow cave behind an ivy curtain on the western slope and about the drainage patterns he had noted in that part of the ravine and about what those drainage patterns would do in a sustained downpour of this magnitude. By dawn, the rain had reduced to a steady, purposeful drizzle that had no intention of stopping. Corwin rose and made a fire in heated water and sat with the tin cup between both hands and looked at the damage the storm had done to the visible world around him. Fallen branches mostly, a section of the slope to the west where something had slid. The creek below, which he could hear but not see from the camp position, was audibly different, faster and fuller and lower in pitch, the way moving water sounds when it is carrying more than it is accustomed to. He broke camp with a thoroughness that went beyond his usual habits and packed his kit and started down the slope, taking the long way around that added 3/4 of an hour to the descent, but brought him past the western face. He found the clearing above the cave empty and the cave itself dark and wet. The ivy curtain hanging half-torn from the rock face water, streaming down the interior walls in thin, constant rills. The makeshift bed of pine branches was sodden. There was evidence of a small fire pit that had not been used recently. Patch's prints were in the mud outside the entrance, and beside them the prints of boots, and both sets of prints led upward on the slope. Corwin stood in the empty cave and looked at the pine branch bed and felt something tighten in his chest that was not a comfortable sensation. He looked at the slope above him. He looked at the sky, which was still delivering rain in a thin, cold curtain that showed no signs of reconsidering. He started climbing. It took him the better part of 2 hours to find the trail. They had made 2 sets of tracks, the boot prints and the paw prints moving upward on the slope in a line that told him a story he could read clearly enough. The boot prints were uneven, the strides shorter than it should have been for someone moving uphill, the depth of impression on the left side consistently deeper than the right, the pattern of someone carrying a significant and unbalanced load on a surface that was offering very little traction. The paw prints beside them were absent for long stretches and then present again as though the dog had been carried and then set down and then carried again. He followed the tracks up through the second growth pine and the rhododendron and the long exposed section of granite that the storm had turned into a tilted sheet of running water, and he climbed with his surveying kit on his back and a pack of provisions he had assembled at the camp before leaving, because it had seemed when he was packing it like the kind of thing a person should do. He could not have articulated the reasoning more specifically than that. What he could not have known climbing that slope in the gray post-storm drizzle was how long the ascent had taken her. The tracks told him some of it, the places where the boot prints stopped entirely and then resumed where she had clearly stood still for a period before continuing. The one section of exposed granite near the upper third where the impressions dug deeply into a patch of mud at the edge of the rock, where she had come down hard on one knee and then pushed back up. There was a smear of something dark on the rock surface there, not mud. He noted it and kept moving. What the tracks could not tell him was what she had been thinking through each of those stops. But he could construct it because it was the same thing any person carrying something they could not afford to lose would have been thinking. He is still breathing. Keep going. He is still breathing. One more step. Patch had been a dead weight in the pack for most of that climb. Not the alive, shifting, adjusting weight of the ravine of Patch, finding the best position and settling into it with the self-awareness of a creature that understood he was cargo and was cooperating with the fact. No, dead weight. The weight of an animal that had stopped having opinions about its own position, that was simply being carried because the person carrying it had not yet accepted any other possibility. She had stopped twice, Corwin could tell from the tracks, not to rest her legs, to press her hand against the rucksack and feel for the rise and fall of breathing. He could see it in the way the prints deepened and narrowed, the way someone stands when they are holding very still and concentrating on something other than standing. And then they went on upward through the mud, in the drizzle, in the treacherous, rain-slicked granite. Because the breathing had still been there, and breathing meant keep going and keep going was the only arithmetic available. He thought about what that had cost her. He thought about it for a long time on the slope. The plateau came up on him suddenly, the way high-elevation flat ground often does in the Blue Ridge. A sudden easing of the grade that opened into a wider sky and a different quality of air. There were weathered pines up here, thick-trunked and wind-shaped, leaning slightly east from decades of prevailing wind. And among them, barely visible until you were almost upon it, a structure of rough-hewn logs and stone that had the quality of something built slowly over years by someone who had wanted primarily to be warm and dry and had not given significant thought to anything beyond those requirements. Smoke came from the stone chimney, thin but real. Corwin stopped at the edge of the tree line and looked at the hut for a long time. Then he crossed the open ground and knocked on the door with his knuckles in a way that was not aggressive, but was clear. There was a silence and then a sound of movement inside, and then the door opened and he was looking at a man he recognized without being able to place immediately the way you recognize someone you have seen from a distance, many times without ever having spoken to. Old with hands and face that had been shaped by decades of outdoor living into something that looked more like geography than anatomy. Pale eyes that assessed him with a completeness he found slightly uncomfortable. Behind the old man, the interior of the hut was lit by a good fire, and by that fire on a worn rug was the girl, and beside her was the dog. The dog was alive. Barely it seemed from the way it lay, but its side was rising and falling, and its eyes were open and tracking. The old man looked at Corwin for a long moment without any readable expression. Then he stepped back from the door and left it open, which Corwin took as an invitation and stepped through. The hut was one room with a table, two chairs of different provenance, a narrow sleeping platform along the north wall, and a hearth that was doing serious work. The smell of wood smoke and pine resin, and something medicinal, a pungent herbal steam rising from a small pot on the fire's edge. The girl looked up at him from beside the dog with the same flat, measuring expression she had given him in the ravine, and he held his hands slightly away from his sides and set the provision pack on the floor near the door to demonstrate that he had come with something useful rather than something threatening. The old man said Silas Greer, not as an introduction exactly, more as a fact he was depositing into the room for whatever use it might be. Corwin Marsh, Corwin said. The girl said nothing. She had her hand on the dog's side, feeling the rise and fall of its breathing with a continuous unconscious attention that reminded him of something he did not want to be reminded of. Silas moved to the hearth and adjusted something in the pot, and then straightened and looked at the dog on the rug with the expression of someone making a professional assessment. He had the deliberate, careful movements of a man who had spent a long time alone and had developed in that solitude an economy of motion that wasted nothing. Lungs took water, he said. Fever's bad. He'll need another day before we know. The girl's hand on the dog's side did not change its pressure or its rhythm. She was listening. Silas took a tin cup from the shelf above the hearth, dipped it into the pot, and brought it to where the dog lay. He crouched with the slowness of someone whose knees had their own opinions about crouching, and he showed the girl how to hold the dog's jaw and dribble the liquid in at the corner of the mouth, a small, steady stream that the dog could swallow without needing to lift its head. She took over the process with a patience that suggested this was not the first time she had cared for something that needed more from her than she had to give. Corwin unpacked the provision sack. Salted pork, a cloth sack of flour, salt, more quinine, a spare wool blanket he had taken from his own bedroll which he would manage without. Silas watched him unpack without comment. Then he went to a wooden chest against the wall and opened it and began to look through its contents with a deliberateness that suggested he was looking for something specific. He found it a folded document and a set of hand-drawn maps, the paper old enough that it had gone from white to the color of old cream. He set them on the table and smoothed them with one hand. Then he said without preamble, without any softening, "Holt is building a dam." The girl's head came up from the dog. Corwin stood very still. Silas sat down in one of the chairs at the table and looked at both of them in turn, and then he began to speak. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed something in his head for so long that the words have worn grooves in him, but has never actually said it out loud. So the groove and the voice don't match quite right. The words coming too fast and then too slow, and then finding a rhythm somewhere in the middle that was less eloquent than it was true. Red Creek Fork, he said, was the primary water source for Ashford, had been for as long as anyone had records of the town. The creek ran through the lower valley and fed the town reservoir and the outlying farms, and had never in living memory run dry or run foul. Holt owned land in the upper watershed, had been acquiring parcels there for the past several years in transactions that were individually unremarkable. He had been building a dam on that land quietly, using contractors brought in from outside the county for the past 8 months. The dam was close to finished. When the gates closed, the creek downstream would begin to drop within 48 hours and would be at a critical level within a week. 3 days from now, there was a town meeting scheduled in Ashford. At that meeting, Holt would stand before the town and present a solution. He had already identified the ravine spring, the same spring that Silas had known about for 30 years, as the alternative water source. Clean, abundant, permanent. He would offer to pipe it to town for a price. A monthly price per household that Silas had heard referenced in a conversation he had no business having overheard, and had spent 3 weeks since then trying to find a flaw in what he had heard and failing. The entire town of Ashford, Silas said, was going to walk into a crisis of Holt's making and out the other side as tenants of his water. The room was quiet when he finished. The fire spoke for a while. Outside, the rain continued its patient work on the mountain. The girl said, "He told everyone this place was poisoned." "Yes," Silas said, "for 30 years. Yes." She looked at the old man with the creek water eyes and said, "Why?" Silas put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. They were the hands of a man in his 8th decade, heavily weathered, the knuckles enlarged, the skin thin enough to see the architecture beneath it. He looked at them the way you look at a thing that has done something you cannot entirely take back. He had been a prospector, he said, not a successful one, but a persistent one, working the small mineral claims in the Blue Ridge that produced enough to sustain hope and not enough to produce wealth. He had known this ravine when it was just a ravine before anyone had thought to call it forbidden. He had camped here, had drunk from the spring, had mapped the water table in the rough, intuitive way of a man who knew what he was looking for and trusted his own observations. 30 years ago, there had been a rock slide in the upper ravine. It had muddied the spring outlet for a season, maybe a little longer. In that same season, one man in Ashford had fallen ill, a genuine illness, though Silas had always suspected it came from something other than the ravine spring. Holt had moved fast, the way he always moved when opportunity presented itself in a form most people had not yet recognized as opportunity. He bought the surrounding land in a week, offering prices that seemed reasonable until you understood what he knew that the sellers did not. He went to the town council with the story of the contaminated ravine, citing the rock slide and the sick man, and a report from a doctor that Silas had always believed was either mistaken or purchased. Silas had known the water was clean. He had tested it himself after the slide when the initial muddiness had cleared. He had walked down into Ashford with the intention of saying so, of standing up at the council meeting and telling them what he knew. He had seen Holt in the street outside the council hall. He had seen the way Holt looked at a man who was about to become inconvenient, a look that contained no threat, no anger, nothing you could point to specifically, only the calm, total certainty of someone who had never lost an argument. He had decided to win and was not planning to start. Silas had not gone into the meeting. He had gone home. He had told himself he would say something later at another time when the circumstances were better, when he had more to back him up than his own word against a man of Holt's standing. Later had never arrived. He had left town the following spring, come up into the ravine, built the hut, and stayed. He had told himself it was because he preferred the solitude. He had known in the part of himself that honest men cannot permanently silence, that it was because he could not look at the town from inside it anymore. 30 years, he said. Every family in that town that couldn't afford what they needed because of the price of water. Every child at Holt's home. Every man working the quarry or the mill to pay rent on land that should have been common ground. His voice had gone flat and very quiet, in the way of voices that have moved past the register of emotion into something more fundamental. I had a piece of all of that. I knew and I said nothing, and I had a piece of all of it. The fire burned, the pot steamed. Patch's breathing on the rug was still labored, but no longer the terrible shallowness of the previous hours. Wren looked at the old man for a long time. She was not looking at him with judgment exactly, though judgment would have been understandable. She was looking at him the way she had looked at many things in the ravine, as information, as something to be understood rather than simply reacted to. Corwin sat down in the other chair at the table and looked at the old map spread under Silas's hands, and then at his own surveying kit propped against the wall by the door. He thought about the locked tin box in his rented room in town. He thought about the false bottom and the actual measurements and the letter in Holt's handwriting directing him to adjust the figures. He thought about what Silas had just said, and he thought about the dam on the upper watershed that he had taken measurements of and recorded faithfully in a separate log he kept encrypted in a notation system. He had developed himself because he had known, at some level, he was not ready to fully acknowledge that he might need those records to mean something someday. He reached into the inner pocket of his field coat and took out a folded set of papers and laid them on the table next to Silas's old maps. He unfolded them. The real measurements, the actual water volume and flow consistency of the ravine's upper spring, the permanent year-round output that is falsified charts recorded as negligible and seasonal. The drainage calculations showing what the spring fed, which was not only the ravine's floor, but the entire western tributary of the watershed, which connected if you followed it through the geology. He had spent months mapping to the same underground table that fed Red Creek Fork. And the letter. Holt's handwriting precise and undemonstrative as everything about him, directing his surveyor to ensure that the upper ravine water source did not appear in the official records as a viable primary supply. And the construction log. 8 months of dam work dated with contractor names, material quantities, payment records, all of it documented in a shorthand he could translate, and all of it predating the rock slide story by decades. He laid it all out on the table and looked at it there beside Silas's old papers and the doctor's affidavit from 30 years ago that Silas had retrieved from the chest. He said he planned this for 5 years. The dam, the drought he was going to create, the solution he was going to sell. All of it was in place before most people in Ashford understood there was a problem. Wren had come to stand at the edge of the table. She was looking at the documents with the focused attention of someone who can read and who understands what reading means, who has used it as a tool for as long as she can remember, because it was the only tool no one could take away from her. She looked at the dates on the construction log. She looked at the letter. She looked at Silas's doctor's affidavit from 30 years prior. She said, "He needs everyone to believe this place is dangerous." She said it quietly, thinking through it as she said it. He's built everything on that. The home, the water, all of it. If the town knows the ravine is clean, the whole story falls apart. Silas looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Then we have to show them," she said. "Not tell them. Show them." She went back to Patch and sat beside him and rested her hand on his side. His breathing had changed in the last hour, settling from the shallow, effortful pattern of a sick animal into something deeper and more regular. Still not right, but different in a way that felt like it was moving in the right direction. He had taken 3 more doses of the herbal tea, one each time Silas had heated a fresh cup, and each time he had swallowed it with a little less resistance than the time before. His nose, which had been hot and dry when she arrived, was beginning to cool. She sat with him and listened to the rain on the roof of the hut and looked at the fire and thought. The 3 of them stayed like that for a while in the silence of people who have arrived at a difficult understanding together and are letting it settle. The rain said its piece to the mountain. The fire did its work. The hut was small and warm and smelled of things that had been there a long time, wood smoke and pine resin, and the accumulated presence of a man who had been living alone with his choices for 30 years. It was Corwin who spoke next. He had been sitting with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, and his eyes on the floor in the posture of a man conducting an argument with himself that he had mostly lost. He told them about the dam site. He had measured it. He knew the exact location, the construction method, the material specifications. He knew that the gate mechanism was designed to be operated by two men and that it was currently in its open position and had been since the beginning of construction because closing it early would have raised questions in town about the dropping creek level before Holt was ready for those questions to be raised. He knew the planned closure date, which was the night before the town meeting timed, so that the effects on the creek would be becoming visible to residents on the morning Holt stood up to offer his solution. He also knew from his work on the upper watershed something that Holt's plan had not accounted for, or had accounted for and dismissed, which was that the ravine spring's output was not confined to the ravine. Under the right conditions, specifically the conditions of a storm like the one that had just passed through, the upper spring overflowed its natural basin and fed directly back into the Red Creek watershed through a series of fissures in the limestone shelf that underlay the upper ridge. Holt's dam would reduce the creek, but the spring would partially compensate for. It would keep the creek from dropping as fast as Holt had calculated, and might buy the town time if someone could direct their attention to what was actually happening before Holt could direct it to himself. Silas was listening to this with his eyes on the table. "The meeting is 3 days from now," he said. "Yes," Corwin said, "and Holt will have the council on his side going in. He always has the council on his side. He's had the council on his side for 20 years. Silas looked at the girl. She was still beside the dog, but she was no longer looking at the fire. She was looking at him. "What can you say that they'll believe?" Silas asked her. Not unkindly, as a real question. She thought about it. She looked down at the dog and then back up. "I've been in the ravine for almost 2 weeks," she said. "I've been drinking the water the whole time. So has he." She indicated Patch with a small movement of her hand. "If the water is what Holt says it is, we're both dead. We're not dead." The simplicity of it sat in the room. "That's not a legal argument," Corwin said. "No," she said. "It's a better one." Silas made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, but was somewhere between them, the sound of a man encountering an unexpected piece of sense in an unexpected place. They worked out the shape of it over the following hours. The three of them at the small table, the fire burning lower and then lower as the night came on, and the rain against the roof subsided from its earlier insistence to something more contemplative. Silas brought out hard cheese and the last of a smoked sausage he had been rationing, and Corwin added the salted pork from his pack, and they ate with the economical focus of people who are working while they eat, talking through the structure of what needed to happen and who needed to do what and in what order. Patch got up once late in the evening and stood with trembling legs for a moment before lowering himself carefully back to the rug. The trembling was different from the trembling of the sickness. It was the trembling of weakness, not collapse. Wren was at his side before he had finished the movement, steadying him, with her hand speaking in that sub-audible way she had. He lay down and put his head on her knee, and she kept her hand on his side through the rest of the evening's planning. Outside, the storm finished what it had come to say and moved on east toward the Piedmont. The moon came out late, thin and new, and lit the plateau around the hut in pale silver that made the weathered pines look like carvings of themselves. The ravine below was invisible in the dark, but present as it was always present up here, in the sound of the water and the smell of the air and the quality of the silence that surrounded a place where something old and undisturbed had been continuing its own business for longer than anyone present could claim to understand. 3 days. They had the real maps. They had the falsified ones. They had Silas's 30-year-old documents in the doctor's affidavit, and Corwin's construction log, and Holt's letter in Holt's own hand. They had the testimony of an old man who had been silent for 3 decades and was not going to be silent anymore, and the evidence of a surveyor who had finally understood that the documents he had been keeping as insurance were actually something more specific than that. And they had Wren, who had walked into a place that was supposed to be poison and had found something else entirely, and who was prepared to stand in front of every person in Ashford and say so. Corwin looked at her across the table in the low light of the fire's last serious effort and tried to reconcile the girl with the flint in the ravine with the person currently working through the logistics of a public confrontation with the most powerful man in the county with the same practical, focused attention she brought to everything else. He could not reconcile them because they were the same person, and he was still in the early stages of understanding what that meant. He thought about the tin box in his rented room in town. He thought about the false bottom. He thought about what it meant to have spent 8 months telling yourself you were keeping something as insurance and to have arrived without quite deciding to arrive at the place where insurance became intention. He had made a practical decision in the ravine, he had told himself. He had assessed the situation and calculated that reporting the girl offered less than it cost. He was beginning to understand that this was not quite what had happened. What had happened was something less tidy and more fundamental than a calculation. What had happened was that he had looked at her hands and made a choice that came from somewhere deeper than practical reasoning, from the place where his daughter's face lived, and where the knowledge of what bad water and a powerful man's indifference could cost a person lived alongside it. He had not been making a practical decision. He had been making a moral one. He had simply not been ready to call it that yet. He looked at the documents spread across Silas's table and understood that he was ready now. She slept that night for the first time in 2 weeks without listening for footsteps. The morning of the first day after the storm, Patch stood on his own 4 feet and stayed there. It was not a dramatic recovery. He rose slowly from the rug by the hearth with the careful deliberateness of an animal that has learned in a short and concentrated period that the body has limits worth respecting. He stood with his legs slightly wider than usual and his head lower than its normal position, and he breathed the warm air of the hut in long, measured pulls. And then he looked at Wren with both eyes, the brown one and the white patch one, and his tail moved once. A single slow sweep that contained everything he needed to say. Wren was beside him before the tail had completed its arc. She pressed her face into the fur at the back of his neck and stayed there with her eyes closed and her hands on either side of him, feeling the warmth of him and the steadiness of his breathing and the realness of him being alive. And she allowed herself exactly that much, that one long moment of relief, before she straightened up and looked at the table where the documents were still spread and thought about what the next 3 days required of her. She had cried twice in the ravine, both times at night, both times quietly in the way she had learned to cry at the home when crying was something that needed to happen but could not be something anyone witnessed. She had not cried this morning. She had looked at Patch standing on his own feet and felt the relief move through her, like water through dry ground, total and immediate. And then she had put it where it needed to go and turned to face the problem. Silas was already at the table. He had been up before she woke and there was tea on, and the documents were reorganized in a way that suggested he had been handling them in the early dark, reviewing what he knew and what he didn't, and what the difference between those two things was going to cost him. He looked up when she came to the table and nodded once, a small acknowledgement that had nothing superfluous in it. Corwin had slept on the floor near the door with his coat over him, and had risen stiff and uncomplaining, and gone outside for a while and come back with more wood for the fire, moving with the purposeful efficiency of a man who has made a decision that has simplified him, removed the friction of uncertainty, and replaced it with the cleaner resistance of a determined course. They ate a breakfast of fried pork and dense bread that Silas made from the flour Corwin had brought, working the dough with his large, deliberate hands and baking it in the pan over the fire in a way that suggested long practice, and they talked while they ate. Not about the plan, they had talked through the plan sufficiently the night before, but about logistics. Who knew which roads into town, what time the meeting was called for, whether Corwin's absence from Holt's work camp would have been noted, and what story might account for it. Corwin said he had told the foreman he was taking additional creek measurements that required a 2-day survey loop. The foreman was not a curious man. He logged what Corwin told him and moved on to the next item. It would hold for another day, possibly 2. Silas said the meeting was called for 7 in the evening at the town hall on Main Street. He said this with the knowledge of a man who had been watching Ashford from a distance for 30 years, who received information about the town the way a man receives weather information, from observation of patterns, and the occasional intercepted detail carried up the mountain by someone who did not know they were carrying it. Wren listened and ate and watched Patch, who had settled near the fire with his chin on his front paws and his eyes moving between the three of them in the slow, attentive circuit of a dog who is too tired to participate but not too tired to follow. She was thinking about Fen. She had been thinking about Fen since the moment she had seen Patch stand up, because Patch standing up meant she had done what she needed to do in this place. And the moment that thought arrived, the next thought behind it was the red cord on a small wrist and a child standing at a gate with a bundle of belongings held against his chest. She did not say this out loud. There was an order to things, and the order required Ashford first. But the thought was there, present and patient, the way Fen himself had been patient at the gate. The 2 days of preparation had a quality that Wren would remember later as being very still and very full. At the same time, the way the air feels before a storm, when everything is suspended in the moment before the first motion. Silas rehearsed his testimony at the fireside in the evenings, speaking quietly and steadily to the flames, not performing, but excavating, finding the words for things he had kept in the wordless interior for 30 years, and discovering that when they came out, they were simpler than he had feared and heavier than he had expected. Sometimes he stopped and sat with his hands on his knees for a long moment before continuing. Wren did not interrupt these silences. She understood what it cost to say a true thing you had been keeping. Corwin organized his documents with the precision of a man who knows that evidence is only as good as its presentation, that the difference between a fact that changes minds and a fact that gets lost in confusion is almost entirely in the arrangement. He made 2 clean copies of the most critical figures in his careful small handwriting, one for the presentation, and one to keep on his person in case the first was lost or taken. He did this without comment, with the focused competence of someone whose professional skills had found, after a long detour through moral compromise, a use they were actually suited for. Wren spent time with the documents herself. She read everything slowly and completely, cross-referencing the old maps with the new ones, reading the doctor's affidavit from 30 years prior 3 times, until she understood exactly what it said and what it did not say, and where the distinction between those two things could be pressed into useful shape. She had taught herself to read from the home's account ledgers and hymnal books and the occasional almanac that made its way into the small shelf in the common room. And she read the way someone reads who has understood from an early age that the ability to read is a form of power that can be kept inside you, where no one can inventory it or assess its productivity or decide it is a drain on resources. She also sat with Patch. She fed him broth and the soft-boiled scraps of pork from each meal and watched his appetite come back with a steadiness that was its own kind of evidence, its own testimony about what the ravine's water and air had and had not done to living things that spent time in it. On the second day, he got up of his own accord and walked to the door and looked at her. And she opened it, and he went outside and stood in the pale mountain sunshine for 10 minutes and then came back in and lay down again. His legs were still not steady, but they were steadier than yesterday. The white patch over his eye had the brightness of a healthy animal, and when she sat next to him, he pressed his warm weight against her leg with the calm, uncomplicated assurance of a creature that has decided the worst is behind them. She decided the same thing. It was a decision she understood, not a conclusion. The situation had not resolved itself into something that justified confidence. Aldous Holt was still Aldous Holt. The town hall would be full of people who had believed him for 20 and 30 years. Belief that old does not displace easily. But she had made decisions under worse conditions than these, had climbed a cliff face in the dark with less certainty than she had now. And she had learned in the ravine and in the 10 years before it that certainty was less useful than clarity. She was clear about what was true. She was clear about what needed to happen. That was enough to go on. On the morning of the 3rd day, she was awake before Silas, which had not happened before. She sat by the low fire and watched the dawn come in through the single high window of the hut, the light shifting from the deep blue-black of full dark through a series of grays that resolved eventually into the pale gold of early mountain morning. The ravine below was invisible in its daily mist, the white mass of it rolling slowly in the basin as the cold air moved, and the tops of the oldest pines stood above it like the masts of ships on a quiet sea. She thought about the girl she had been at 8 years old, arriving at the home with nothing understanding, nothing except that the world she had been part of had closed its door. She thought about the 10 years of learning to be invisible, of building the wall, of the careful daily work, of keeping the coal of herself burning without letting anyone see the smoke. She thought about the office that smelled of leather, and the thin smile, and the sentence delivered in a pleasant, measured voice. The dog will be removed by noon today. She had been running from that sentence. She understood this now with a clarity the ravine had given her, the way the ravine gave you. Clarity about everything, stripping things to their actual weight, their actual substance, by removing the distractions that normally obscure them. She had been running from the sentence and from the man who delivered it and from the system that gave him the authority to deliver it. But she was not running anymore. She was going back. Silas rose and found her at the fire and made no comment on the earliness of the hour. He made tea and sat in his chair, and they sat together in the comfortable silence of people who have established through a few days of concentrated shared circumstance a relationship that does not require filling. After a while, he said quietly, "The hardest part of saying a true thing in public is that you cannot take it back afterward." He said it without ornament. As a fact, he was depositing for whatever use it might be. I spent 30 years deciding whether I was ready for that. She looked at him. "Are you ready now?" He looked at his hands. "No," he said, "but I'm going anyway." She nodded. That seemed right to her. She had never waited until she was ready for anything. Ready was a threshold that kept moving when you needed it most. Corwin rose an hour later and they broke their camp in the hut with a thoroughness that respected the fact that they might not be returning to it together. Silas packed his most important documents into a leather satchel that had been hanging on the wall since Corwin arrived and had clearly not been taken down in some time. He moved through the hut with the deliberateness of a man saying goodbye to a place, touching the surfaces of it without sentimentality but with attention. The way you attend to something you have been part of for a long time and are about to step away from. Wren lifted Patch into the pack. He had gotten heavier in 2 days. She took that as a good sign. They descended from the plateau in the mid-morning, taking the longer route that came out on the northern approach to Ashford, rather than the main road where Corwin's absence from the work camp would be more conspicuous. The mountain released them into the foothills in the early afternoon, the dense forest thinning to second growth, and then to cleared land, and then to the outskirts of the town. The first buildings appearing in the way buildings always appear after time in the wilderness, with a kind of shocking density, too much structure, too many right angles, the world of human organization imposing itself on the eye after days of the mountain's more various geometry. Silas had a connection in town, a woman who had bought butter from him irregularly for 20 years and who asked no questions and kept her own counsel. She had a small house near the edge of town with a garden that screened the rear door from the street, and when they arrived at that rear door in the middle of the afternoon, she opened it without particular surprise and let them in and fed them soup and went back to her business. Silas had told Wren simply that some people in Ashford had longer memories than Holt found convenient, and that 30 years was a long time for a town to be owned by one man without someone noticing. Wren used the time in the small house to make herself presentable, which required more effort than she had resources for, but produced eventually something workable. The woman, whose name was Desta, found a dress that had belonged to a younger sister and altered it in an hour with a needle and thread and the practical competence of someone who has been solving problems with available materials her whole life. It was a simple gray wool, a little large in the shoulders, but it was clean and intact, and it made Wren look, when she stood in front of the small mirror Desta provided, like someone who had come to a meeting on purpose rather than someone who had climbed down from a mountain. She looked at her face in the mirror for a longer time than she meant to. She had not looked at her own face in 2 weeks, and the face that looked back at her was not entirely the one she had been carrying in her memory. The jaw was the same. The Creekwater eyes were the same. But something in the expression was different, had shifted in the days on the cliff and in the ravine and in the hut on the plateau. Some quality of the set of the features that was harder to describe than to recognize. She had gone up the mountain as someone who had spent 10 years learning to be invisible. The face in the mirror was not invisible. It was the opposite of invisible. It was the face of someone who had decided to be seen. She looked at it for another moment, and then she turned away from the mirror and went to where Patch was resting near Desta's kitchen hearth and sat beside him and put her hand on his warm side and felt the steady, uncomplicated certainty of his breathing. The town hall filled early. Wren stood outside with Corwin in the alley beside the building and listened to the sound of it, the low accumulation of voices that is the sound of a community in a state of collective anxiety gathering together. Because that is what communities do when they are afraid and do not yet know what to be afraid of. She could hear the individual sounds resolving into something larger and less individual, the crowd mind forming its own weather. Silas had gone in ahead of them, taking a seat near the back, with the specific practiced inconspicuousness of someone who has spent 30 years being overlooked by a town that had no particular reason to think about him. He had aged well for this purpose. Old men who sit quietly in the back of rooms are part of the furniture of such rooms. Corwin stood beside Wren in the alley with his documents in the leather case under his arm. He had shaved that morning at Desta's kitchen basin and was wearing the cleaner of his 2 field shirts and looked in the gray afternoon light like a man who had made a significant decision recently and was carrying the weight of it with a directness that was not entirely comfortable, but was not something he was interested in putting down. He said, "Once we go in, there's no version of this where Holt doesn't know it was us." "I know," she said. "He has considerable influence with the county court, with the sheriff." "I know that too." He looked at her for a moment. He had been doing this occasionally over the past 2 days, these brief direct assessments, as though checking that what he thought he understood about her was still accurate, and finding it was. "You're not afraid," he said. It was not quite a question. She considered it honestly. "I'm afraid," she said. "I just don't find it very informative." He made a sound that was the nearest she had heard him come to a laugh, a short, surprised exhalation that broke something in his expression and left it briefly more open. Then the opening closed again, and he straightened and looked at the back door of the town hall. "He'll come after the documents first," Corwin said. "He'll try to say they're fabricated. My word against his, he'll argue that a disgruntled employee had means and motive to falsify." "But the letter is in his handwriting," she said. "Yes, and there will be people in that room who have seen his handwriting on contracts and council documents for 20 years. He paused. "That's the one he can't explain away." She nodded. She looked at the back door. She could hear the meeting inside beginning to settle, the crowd noise dropping as whoever was managing the proceedings called for order. She heard Holt's voice, distant and muffled by the wooden walls. Not the words, but the register of it, that smooth, unhurried confidence that filled a room the way smoke fills a room, moving into every corner before you have quite identified its source. She looked down at Patch. She had taken him out of the pack when they reached the alley, and he was standing beside her with his weight distributed evenly and his ears up. He was not fully recovered. He would not be fully recovered for some days yet. But he was present, and he was attending to the situation with the focused readiness of an animal that has been through something serious and has come out of it with an additional layer of alertness, the awareness of a creature that knows the difference between comfortable and safe. She reached down and touched the top of his head once. He leaned into her hand. She straightened up and opened the back door of the town hall. The room was larger than it seemed from outside, and it was full, every bench taken and people standing along both walls holding lanterns that added their individual warmth to the oil lamps mounted along the walls and created a light that was simultaneously bright and flickering alive in the way of light that comes from burning things. The smell was wet wool and the smoke of too many people in a closed room, and beneath that, the older smell of a building that had been the site of civic anxiety on many occasions. Holt stood at the front of the room beside a large easel on which a map had been mounted. Corwin's falsified map, the one that showed the ravine's water source as negligible and the town's water crisis as an act of nature rather than an act of engineering. He was speaking when Wren came through the back door, and he was doing it well. He was always doing it well. His voice filled the room the way it always had, not loudly but completely, the way smoke fills a space before you notice you are breathing it, and he was employing it now at its most effective register. The tone of a reasonable man reluctantly delivering difficult news. A man who had hoped not to have to burden his neighbors with this information, but who could not in good conscience withhold it any longer. The creek was failing, he said. The drought conditions in the upper watershed were more severe than anyone had initially understood. The projections he had commissioned here, he indicated the map with a gesture that managed to be both precise and modest, showed that without intervention, the town reservoir would reach critical levels within the month. He paused. He let the room breathe with that information, feel its weight begin to construct the fear that would make the solution feel like relief. And then, fortunately, he said, and the word fortunately landed in the room with all the weight he had intended for it through his own surveys of the upper watershed, he had identified an alternative water source. A spring in the upper ravine far from the contamination that had made that area hazardous for so many years, but accessible through a pipe system that he had already begun to design. He was prepared, he said, to fund the initial construction himself, as a contribution to the community he had served for 2 decades, and to manage the system's ongoing operation for a reasonable monthly fee per household. It was the sentence reasonable monthly fee that Wren heard most clearly standing at the back of the room, because that sentence was the machinery of the thing, the fulcrum on which 30 years of preparation balanced, and she understood now with total clarity why every piece of it had been necessary. The contaminated ravine had been necessary so that he could control the spring. Controlling the spring had been necessary so that when the creek failed, which he had arranged to fail, he would be the only available solution. He had manufactured the problem, the crisis, and the answer, and he was collecting payment for all three simultaneously. She moved along the wall toward the front. People noticed her before she reached the halfway point, the movement attracting attention the way movement in a still space always does, and a ripple of shifting awareness followed her progress along the wall. Faces turning the crowd's collective attention, redirecting, and by the time she was clearly visible to the front of the room, the crowd's attention had already divided itself between her and Holt in a way that even Holt, whose awareness of her room was considerable, could not fail to register. He registered it. She saw the moment he saw her, the slight pause in the delivery, the infinitesimal adjustment of the expression, and then the smoothness returning the recovery so practiced it was nearly invisible. Silas stood up from the back. He did not wait to be invited, and he did not wait for a moment of formal transition. He simply stood up, and his age and the quality of his stillness created a pause in the room's attention that gave him the floor before anyone had officially given it. "My name is Silas Greer," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The room had gone very quiet with the attention of a crowd that has sensed something is happening that is not on the program. Some of you will remember me. Most of you probably won't. I left Ashford 30 years ago after a decision I made that I've been paying for ever since. And I came back tonight because the time for paying for it privately is done. He began to speak. Holt attempted the interruption at the third sentence, a smooth, concerned interjection about the importance of allowing proper process to govern civic discussions. And Silas stopped, looked at him, and continued. There was something in the way Silas looked at him that Wren suspected Holt had not encountered often. The look of a man who has already lost everything that could be taken, who has spent 30 years in voluntary exile and has come down from the mountains specifically because he has decided that the cost of speaking is less than the cost of continued silence. There was no leverage to apply to that. Holt understood leverage. He did not have a tool for its absence. Silas told it all. The rock slide, the muddy spring, the one sick man, Holt's move on the land, his approach to the town council, the doctor's report that Silas had always doubted, the meeting he had walked toward and turned away from. He told it in the flat, undecorated way he had been practicing by the fire, without asking for sympathy, without mitigating his own role in it, because he had understood in the preparation that asking for sympathy was a form of asking people to do work for you. And he had been asking this town to do his work for him for 30 years already. The room listened. Wren watched the room listen. She could see the different ways the information landed in different people. The older faces that were tracking something they had half remembered and never fully questioned. The middle-aged faces doing the arithmetic of how long they had been paying for water and what that amount accumulated to over years, the younger faces simply trying to understand what they were hearing. Corwin went next. He unrolled his documents at the table at the front of the room with the precise, deliberate movements of someone who has done careful work and is prepared to stand behind it. And he laid the falsified map alongside his own, and the difference was visible from the third row. He explained the difference in technical terms, and then in plain ones, and he placed the construction log on the table and read dates from it, and then placed Holt's letter alongside and read the relevant lines and did not editorialize. The room's noise level had been rising in a particular way, not the disorganized noise of a crowd losing interest, but the directed, specific noise of people processing information that is changing something. It was the sound of collective understanding in the process of forming of a story people had believed for a long time beginning to show its seams. Holt moved then. He had been standing at the front of the room with the stillness of someone who has decided that the best defense against chaos is demonstrated calm. But now he moved, stepping forward with the silver-tipped cane, making its familiar measured percussion on the floor. And he smiled the thin diagram smile and said in the pleasant, unhurried voice, "I appreciate the passion of these presentations, I do, but I would ask you to consider the sources." He said it with a tone of pained reasonableness. A man who has been living alone on a mountainside for 30 years, a disgruntled former employee, and a young woman, a minor who ran away from the care of this institution in an apparent state of significant mental distress. The last phrase landed in the room with the precision of something aimed. Wren had been waiting for it. She had known it was coming because it was the only tool he had left, and Aldous Holt was not a man who failed to use available tools. She had thought about how to answer it for 2 days, and what she had concluded was that the answer was not words. She said clearly enough for the front half of the room to hear, "I have been living in the ravine for almost 3 weeks. I have been drinking the water from the spring every day. So has my dog." She reached into the rucksack and lifted Patch out and set him on the floor. He stood. He stood on the wooden floor of the Ashford Town Hall with his legs steady and his ears up, and the white patch over his left eye, bright in the lantern light, and he turned his head to look at the room, the way dogs look at rooms full of strangers, with a comprehensive, rotating attention, checking the space and its contents, and filing his assessments. Then he walked at his own pace and in his own direction along the open space at the front of the room, his claws making small, clear sounds on the floor. He was alive. He was healthy. He had been drinking the water of the Forbidden Ravine for 3 weeks, and he was walking across the floor of the town hall in front of 200 people, and there was nothing wrong with him that time, and rest would not address. That was the argument. The entire argument embodied in one animal walking across the floor. The room's noise shifted again, a different frequency, harder to characterize, the sound of 200 people's understanding of a story they had told themselves for 30 years, beginning to be replaced by something that had no previous frame, something that would need to be named and organized and dealt with by each of them individually in the time after this meeting, but that was already present in the room in a way that could not be recalled. Holt said something else. Wren did not hear what it was because the room's noise had risen enough to absorb it. She saw him say it, and she saw the expression he deployed while saying it, and she saw that neither the words nor the expression were landing the way they were designed to land, that the room had shifted its weight and was no longer responsive to the things it had been responsive to 10 minutes ago. But he was not finished. She had known he would not be finished. A man who has been building something for 30 years does not surrender it in a single sentence. He pivoted, and she watched him pivot with the smoothness of long practice, turning to address the section of the room where the older family sat, the ones who had known him longest. He spoke about credibility, about track record, about what it meant to take the word of a child who had run away from proper care and a hermit who had abandoned his community over the word of a man who had spent 2 decades investing in Ashford's future. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His voice was its own argument, moderate and certain, and utterly without doubt. She saw a few heads in the crowd nodding. Not many, but a few. And a few in a room that had almost turned was enough to tip it back. This was what he did. This was what he had always done. He did not fight. He redirected. He found the uncertain people, and he spoke directly to their uncertainty, validating the doubt they were already carrying. The doubt that said, "This is too much to believe," about a man we have known for 20 years. The doubt that said, maybe the simpler explanation is true, maybe the girl is unstable and the old man is addled, and the surveyor has a grudge. He was seeding those doubts now, watering them with the calm certainty of his manner, and she could see it working in the shifting expressions of the people in the middle rows. She called to Patch with a small sound. He came to her and she picked him up and held him against her side and looked at the room, at the faces, at the doubt Holt was growing in them like something patient and persistent, the same way he had been growing things in people for decades. And then the woman in the front row stood up. Wren had not known she was there. She had not been looking at the front row, had been watching the room's middle, tracking the crowd's response. And so Clara Holt standing up was a surprise, not in its significance, which Wren understood immediately and completely, but in its timing and in the quality of it. The absolute stillness of the woman as she stood, the way the room felt her stand even before it saw her. Clara Holt was a woman of perhaps 50 with hair gone to a silver that was not soft but precise, and a face that held a kind of tragic composure, the expression of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally found or been found by the moment to set it down. She was dressed well, as she always was, because she had always been by position and habit dressed well. And the quality of her clothing in that room of wet wool and working clothes was another kind of visibility. A visibility she seemed neither to be using nor ignoring. She did not look at Wren. She did not look at Silas or Corwin. She looked at the room, at the assembled faces of the people she had lived among for 30 years. And she said, "My husband is a man who is very good at telling stories." She said it with the quiet precision of someone stating a fact they have tested extensively and found consistently true. I know this because I have been living inside one of his stories for 30 years, and I have only recently understood what the story was about. The room was completely silent. She told them about Thomas, her son. He had died of the creek fever 30 years ago, in the same season as the rock slide, in the same season, when a contamination of the upstream water was known by the man who had built the quarry to be a potential consequence of its construction. The doctor had told her husband. She had not known this at the time, had believed the story about the ravine spring, had not known that there was another explanation available that her husband had chosen not to share with the town because sharing it would have cost him more than not sharing it. She had found out 7 years later in a letter from the doctor written in the doctor's last illness, the kind of letter a man writes when he has decided that the cost of continued silence exceeds the cost of honesty. She had confronted her husband. He had been very calm. He had explained his reasoning. He had used the word practical. She had stayed. She had told herself many things about why she stayed, and she had believed some of them for varying lengths of time. And she was not going to explain any of that to this room because it was not what this room needed from her. What this room needed from her was the truth. And the truth was this: her son's death and Silas's silence had given Aldous Holt the story he needed. And he had used that story to take from every person in this room something they had not known they were giving. He had let Thomas become a lie, and she was not going to let Thomas remain one. She sat down. The room did not erupt. It did not do the thing that rooms and stories do at the crucial moment of revelation, the dramatic surge of voices in motion. Instead, it went very quiet, a more complete silence than it had achieved at any previous point in the evening. The silence of a large group of people simultaneously absorbing something that has permanently altered the architecture of their understanding. It was not a comfortable silence. It was the silence of people who have just been handed the correct amount of weight for the thing they are holding. Holt stood at the front of the room in that silence, and for the first time in Wren's experience of him, in the 10 years she had spent in his institution, in the 3 hours she had spent in his presence in this room, he did not look like a man with a plan. He looked like a man who had built something very large on a foundation he had believed was permanent and had just discovered at the worst possible moment that it was not. His face did not collapse. It was subtler than that. It was a diminishment, a reduction, a precise and involuntary revealing of the smaller figure that had been inside the larger one all along. He said nothing. The town council met for 4 hours the following morning. Corwin was present with his documents. The county surveyor was sent for a man of independent standing who was given Corwin's real measurements and Holt's letter in 2 hours to form an opinion. His opinion delivered at noon to the assembled council was that the measurements were accurate, and the letter was inconsistent with the narrative Holt had presented to the town for 3 decades. Holt was not at the council meeting. He had not been seen since the town hall. Wren walked past his house the afternoon of the following day, not intending to, or perhaps intending to, without knowing it, following a route through town that brought her along the ridge road where the black iron gate stood open and the long gravel drive curved up toward the large house with its view of the valley. She stopped at the gate and looked. The house was empty in the way of a place that has been vacated deliberately rather than abandoned carelessly. The windows were shuttered, the stable doors were closed, the flower beds that had always been maintained in those geometrically precise rows, so similar to the flower beds at the home, were still neat, but the neatness had a different quality. Now the neatness of something no longer tended rather than the neatness of something actively maintained. It was the same and completely different the way a room is the same and completely different once the person who made it theirs is no longer in it. She stood at the gate for a long time. She had expected to feel something clear. Victory maybe, or relief, or the particular satisfaction of seeing a reckoning arrive. What she felt instead was more complicated and less comfortable than any of those things. She felt the weight of 30 years of harm that no departure could undo. She felt the faces of the children at the home, the ones who would not be children anymore, the ones who had been sent to the quarry and the laundry and had come back with abraded hands and something abraded in their eyes as well. She felt Fenn's small hand holding the piece of paper she had pressed into it at the gate. She felt all of it at once, and it did not resolve into satisfaction. What it resolved into was something closer to understanding. Power like Holt's does not end. It migrates. It finds new forms. The man was gone, but the damage was not gone, and the work of repairing it was not the dramatic work of a single night in a town hall, but the long, unspectacular work of communities learning to govern themselves, to trust each other, to notice what was happening in the spaces between them and say something about it. She turned away from the gate and walked back into town. His house, the large one on the ridge road, was empty by the following afternoon. His carriage was gone. His staff had been given notice the previous evening. Men arrived from the county seat the following week. Quiet men in good coats who spent 2 days in the house and the office and left with boxes and the legal process of unwinding what a man who owns a great deal can put in motion when he has decided to go, began its long, unglamorous work. The dam on Red Creek Fork was found by a county inspector 4 days later. The gate mechanism was examined and declared intact, and the decision was made to demolish rather than leave in place a structure that had no legitimate purpose and a considerable illegitimate history. The demolition took the better part of a week and produced, when it was done, a creek that ran at its natural level for the first time in 8 months. People came to look at it. Some of them brought their children. A woman who had lived by the creek her entire life stood at its bank for a long time and said nothing. The Holt Foundling Home passed to the administration of the town council, which appointed a committee and then a director, and then began the slow process of deciding what it should actually be. The committee's first act was to remove the nightly dormitory patrols from the schedule. Its second was to open the windows. Wren found Fenn at this Presbyterian church on Caldwell Street on the fourth day after the town hall meeting. She did not know exactly what she would find, and so she had not prepared herself for any specific version of it, had simply walked to the church with Patch beside her and knocked on the minister's door. The minister was a man of middle age with an expression of practiced equanimity that shifted when she gave him her name into something more specific and more present. He told her the boy was in the garden. He said this with a simplicity that suggested the answer to her question was uncomplicated, and it was. Fenn was in the small kitchen garden behind the church, sitting in the dirt between two rows of early spring vegetables, engaged in some project involving sticks and stones, whose organizational principle was not immediately apparent. He had a blanket around his shoulders and the thin coat she remembered, and he was wearing it over a new shirt that was too large for him and had probably come from the church's charity supply. He looked up when she came through the gate. He looked at her wrist where the red cord had been. Then he looked at his own wrist where it was visible above the edge of his coat sleeve. He stood up. He was still very small. Children at 6 are very small, and she had been carrying the weight of him in her mind for 2 weeks in a way that had made him larger in her imagination than the actual person now standing in the dirt of the church garden, looking at her with the watchful, evaluating attention that had been his primary expression since she had known him. She crouched down in front of him. She reached for his wrist and she untied the red cord with the same care she had tied it, easing the double knot loose without pulling. She held it for a moment. Then she tied it back around her own wrist, where it had always been in the double knot that would hold. He watched her do this with a seriousness that she met with equal seriousness. "You waited," she said. He nodded. "Are they treating you well here?" He considered this with the thoroughness of a 6-year-old evaluating an important question. "The soup is better than the home," he said, "and they don't check the dormitory at night." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into the pack and brought out Patch, who had been patient through the walk and through the conversation and was prepared to be patient no longer. And she set him on the ground, and he walked the 2 steps to Fenn and pressed his nose against the boy's hand. Fenn went absolutely still. He was 6 years old, and he had heard about the dog, but had not yet met him, and the white-patched eye and the brown one looking up at him from shin height were more than he had been prepared for. He looked at Wren with a question in his face. She nodded. He put his small hand on Patch's head with the careful reverence of a child touching something important, something he understood mattered to someone he trusted and therefore mattered to him. Patch leaned into the touch with the complete, uncomplicated generosity of an animal that has enough warmth to share. They stayed like that for a moment, the boy and the dog in the dirt of the church garden between the early spring rows, and Wren crouched beside them and watched and understood that this child was going to be all right. Not because she could guarantee that, not because the world had shown any particular intention to be fair to children who started from nothing, but because she recognized in him the thing she had spent 10 years building in herself. The thing that the home and Holt and every version of the same calculating cruelty had been designed to extinguish and had failed to extinguish. The coal that kept burning. The interior life that had no inventory value and could not be assessed and had survived every attempt to make it into something useful and profitable because it had never been any of those things. She stood up. She left Fenn in the garden with the minister's assurance that the town committee had several families interested in taking children from the home, and that Fenn's case was one of the first being reviewed. She left him there with Patch still leaning against his leg, and the stick and stone arrangement in the dirt behind him, and the new shirt that was too large, and the soup that was better than the home's. And she walked back through Ashford with her hands in her pockets and her face tilted up toward the ridge, and she felt something that was not quite joy and not quite grief, but held both of them the way the mountain holds both winter and spring at once, in the weeks when one is ending and the other has not fully arrived. She left Ashford that afternoon. She went back up the mountain. Silas gave her the land in early May when the ground had softened enough to work, and the last of the high-elevation snow had finished its departure from the north-facing slopes. It was a small parcel on the sunward side of the spring where the water came out of the rock in a quiet, permanent thread and spread into a shallow, boulder-edged pool before running downhill through a channel that generations of small mountain erosion had carved. The soil around it was dark and dense with the richness of ground that has been receiving organic matter for decades without ever being turned. He transferred the parcel with the legal instrument that Corwin had helped him draft standing at the table in the hut with the late spring light coming through the window, and he said when she moved to thank him, "This is what I owe the place. Not to you, to the place." And then he said nothing else about it because he was not a man who required acknowledgement for things he believed were simply what was owed. They built the garden in stages. Corwin came up on the weekends initially, and then more often, and then the pattern of his presence became simply a pattern unremarked and consistent, the way things become unremarked when they are the right shape for the space they occupy. He had resigned his position with the surveying company, had taken work with the county assessor's office, doing work that was similar in its technical requirements and different in everything else. And he came up to the ravine on the days he was not needed elsewhere and worked the garden with a quiet attention that Wren recognized as the attention of someone who has found a use for their hands that they can respect. He showed her how to read the slope of the ground for drainage, how to plant rows that followed the contour rather than fighting it, how to understand what a particular combination of soil texture and moisture and sun exposure was likely to support and what it would resist. He showed her with a patience that was not teacherly, but simply available, the patience of someone who has knowledge and is willing to share it without making a transaction of the sharing. Silas came down from the hut most afternoons and sat on the large flat rock near the spring's outflow and watched the work or contributed to it, offering observations about the plant life of the Blue Ridge High Country with the specificity of someone who has been studying it with a great deal of time and very little else to do. He knew which plants would take hold in the rocky margins and which needed deeper soil. He knew where the late frost came from and how long they lasted and what they could be expected to do to anything that had not yet hardened into itself. He offered these things without preamble as additions to whatever conversation was already happening, the way you add something to the common table when you have it to contribute. The three of them work together in the way of people who have been through something serious and come out of it with a mutual understanding that does not need much elaboration, that exists in the space between words rather than in the words themselves. Wren had not had many experiences of this kind of understanding. She found it less uncomfortable than she had expected. There was something developing between her and Corwin that neither of them was in a hurry to name. It was not the sudden dramatic thing that stories sometimes describe, not the lightning of it, but something that built the way the garden built slowly and from the ground up, root before stem before leaf, nothing visible for a long time, and then suddenly undeniable. He understood her need for space. He understood that she had spent 10 years in a place where she had no control over anything, and that the antidote to that was not someone else making decisions on her behalf, but someone standing alongside while she made her own. He never pushed. He never presumed. He was simply there, steady and reliable, and she was learning slowly what it felt like to let someone be there without waiting for the moment they would use it against her. Clara Holt came in late May on a Tuesday afternoon when the light on the ravine walls had the quality of late spring in the mountains, gold and unhurried, reaching into the deep green of the canopy and laying itself across the spring's pool in a way that made the water look lit from below. She came alone on foot, dressed simply in a plain gray coat that bore no resemblance to the formal clothing of the town hall, and wore her silver hair loose in a way that made her look more herself than the town hall version of her, and also somehow smaller. She brought a leather satchel. Inside it were two things: a thick botanical reference volume, the kind that had been expensive when it was printed, and had only become more so with age, with color plates of mountain plants and marginal notes in a careful hand, and a set of gardening tools, high quality, the kind made to last for decades rather than seasons. She set them on the flat rock near the spring and stood with her hands at her sides and looked at Wren in a way that was direct and did not ask for anything, did not perform contrition or request absolution, but held in it something that Wren recognized without being able to immediately name. She said, "He took Thomas's life and made a lie of it. You made it something else." Wren looked at her. She did not know what to say to that, and she thought perhaps she did not need to say anything, that some things are complete in themselves and do not require response. She nodded once in the way she had once learned to nod, to give nothing. But this was different. This was a nod that was genuinely receiving something, that understood what was being offered and accepted it without flinching. Clara Holt looked at the spring and at the turned earth of the young garden, and at Patch, who was investigating the satchel with the thoroughness of his profession, and then she looked at the ravine itself, the great green wound of it dropping away below them in its forest and its mist. She looked at it for a long time with the expression of someone seeing a thing they had been told not to see for 3 decades and finding it different from what they had been told. Then she picked up the satchel which Patch had finished with and walked back the way she had come. Wren watched her go until the tree line took her. She stood at the edge of the spring for a moment after she was gone, looking at the tools and the botanical reference on the flat rock. And then she picked them up and carried them to the work table Corwin had built at the edge of the cleared ground, and she set them down and ran her hand over the cover of the book, feeling the worn leather of it, the weight of it. She did not see Clara Holt again, but she used the tools every day from that point forward, and she read the botanical reference from cover to cover twice over the course of that summer. And she thought of Thomas, sometimes a boy she had never known, whose death had been made into a story that had controlled an entire community for 30 years. And she thought about what it meant to take a lie that had been built on loss and make it into something true. She was not sure she had the words for it exactly, but she thought she understood the shape of it. June brought the first real growth. The rows that had been bare turned earth became the first suggestions of structure, small green presences organizing themselves against the dark soil in the tentative way of new things testing whether the ground will support them. Corwin identified each variety as it emerged with a quiet satisfaction that was not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. The satisfaction of someone who has correctly understood a system and is watching the system confirm the understanding. Silas checked the progress each afternoon with a different kind of attention, the attention of someone who has seen many springs in many years and knows which of these things will hold and which will not. The town of Ashford was changing slowly and imperfectly the way communities change when the central authority has been removed, and they have discovered that they are capable of being their own authority. The council met regularly now for actual governance rather than the rubber stamping of decisions already made elsewhere. People argued, people disagreed. Things moved slowly and sometimes moved backward before they moved forward. But they moved. The Foundling home had a new director who had opened all the windows and removed the dormitory patrols and was working through the long, unglamorous process of turning an institution of control into something that resembled care. It would take years. Some of the damage would never be fully repaired. But the windows were open, and that was a beginning. On an afternoon in the third week of June, Wren sat on the warm, flat rock by the spring and watched Patch. He was chasing a yellow butterfly, which was not behaving in a way that cooperated with being chased. He moved through the cleared ground of the garden margin with the full commitment of an animal who has decided that this is the most important thing happening anywhere and who intends to pursue it to its conclusion, regardless of the conclusion's likelihood. His legs were fully steady now. His coat had come back to the density and gloss of a healthy animal. The white patch over his eye caught the afternoon light in a way that made it look painted on, which it always had even when he was a half-dead puppy in a pile of kitchen scraps behind the home's kitchen building on a gray October afternoon 2 years ago. The butterfly was yellow in the specific, unpredictable way of butterflies rising and falling and redirecting in response to logic that had nothing to do with Patch's intentions, and Patch followed it with an exuberance that was neither dignified nor concerned with dignity. Wren watched him and felt something that was not one emotion, but a convergence of several, relief and grief, and the weight of time, and something that was lighter than both of those, something that lived in the region where those things overlapped, where the loss of one version of yourself and the finding of another intersect in the space. A life makes when it has been turned from one direction and begins to move in a new one. She looked at the garden. The first green rose, the dark soil, the spring running in its quiet, permanent thread, from the rock into the pool and out through the channel downhill. She looked at the ravine walls dropping away below the ancient pines and their curtains of moss, the mist in the lower basin beginning its daily reformation as the afternoon cooled toward evening. She looked at Silas on his rock, reading the botanical reference that Clara Holt had brought, turning pages with the deliberate attention of a man who has discovered at 72 that there are still things he does not know about a place he has lived beside for 30 years. She looked at Corwin, working the far edge of the garden plot, with a spade moving methodically along the row, with the patient thoroughness of someone who has learned to find comfort in the rhythm of useful work. He looked up as though he felt her looking and held her gaze for a moment, and then returned to his row, and the simplicity of that exchange was its own kind of statement. The winter would come. She understood this, understood it in the practical terms of someone who had already thought through what it would require, what needed to be stored and prepared and reinforced and learned before the Blue Ridge showed this parcel of ground what it was capable of in the cold months. The town's future was not settled, was still in the long, imprecise process of communities reordering themselves when the central authority has been removed and they have discovered that they are capable of being their own authority. Things would be difficult, and things would be wrong, and things would require more from the people involved than the people involved were always certain they had to give. But she had been at the bottom of difficult before. She had been in the place where difficult becomes the definition of the available options, where the only question is what you will do within the constraints of what is possible. She had stood at the top of a cliff face in the dark, and she had climbed down it with her hands already bleeding and a dog on her back, and nothing more than necessity and the stubbornness of someone who has been told all her life what she cannot do. She had found the spring. She had found the truth in the water. She had gone back into the town that had been someone else's story, and she had put the real story in the middle of it and stood beside it and waited while it did. What true things do when they are finally said out loud in rooms full of people who have been waiting without knowing they were waiting to hear them. Here. She was 18 years old. She had a parcel of land and a spring and a half-made garden and a dog chasing a yellow butterfly in the afternoon light of a June that was going to be whatever else it was going to be, nothing like any June she had experienced before. Patch made a leap at the butterfly. The butterfly rose indifferent over his head and continued on whatever business had brought it to this particular corner of the Blue Ridge. Patch landed, looked after it for a moment, with the expression of an animal reassessing its strategy, and then turned and came back across the garden to where she sat and pressed his weight against her leg, and looked up at her with both eyes, the brown one and the white patch one, both of them present and attending and entirely at ease. She put her hand on his head. He leaned into it. Behind her, the spring ran in its quiet, permanent way out of the rock and into the pool, and down through the channel to wherever it was going, as it had been doing before any of them arrived, and as it would continue doing long after the garden had grown into something she could not yet see, but was no longer afraid to imagine. The water was clean and cold, and it tasted of minerals and depth, in the deep time of mountains, and it was real, and it was hers, and it had always been there, waiting below the surface of the lie that had been built to contain it, patient as stone, clear as truth running on. She was home.